Go ahead. Tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you are.
A little bit about myself.
Mm-hmm. For the viewers, if there's somebody that watches that doesn't know you.
Well...
What's your name?
My name is Edward Mockford, and I'm a retired entomologist who taught entomology at a university for 26 years. I've been retired for 25 years, and I still work on insects. I did my master's work at the University of Florida back in the early 50s, and I finished my master's degree in January 1954. It had been a difficult couple of years, and I was pretty exhausted, and I wasn't about to start doctoral work at that time. Also, you will perhaps recall that that was the period during which the Korean War was going on, and I had gotten deferments to stay out of the draft for quite some time. I think I began getting deferments while I was still an undergraduate student, so I had quite a few deferments, and I figured they're not going to defer me forever. And when they realize that I'm not going to start a new program, a doctoral program, they'll probably want to draft me pretty quickly. Actually, they let me stay at the University of Florida for another semester, and I took a couple of courses and did research on the little bugs that I was studying. And at the end of that semester, they drafted me. Now that was the end also of the Korean War.
So about 1954.
Yeah, the shooting had stopped, but the government said we're still in the Korean emergency, so the draft continued, and so I got caught in it, and was sent to, since I was there in Florida, I was sent to Fort Gordon, Georgia for my basic training, and after that they sent me to a medical, I've forgotten what they call it, but sort of medical supplementary unit in Savannah, Georgia, or near Savannah, Georgia, at an Army installation called Fort Stewart, and I was there for a little over a month. It became obvious to everyone involved, certainly including me, that there was nothing to do. These medical service outfits didn't do much anyway. They were supposed to inspect latrines and kitchens, and it took about 2 people to do the inspecting for that facility. So they decided to send me elsewhere, and in about mid-August, mid to late August, sometime around in there, I received orders to travel to Frederick, Maryland, which I have to admit I had never heard of at the time, and to report to, they called it then Camp Detrick, which subsequently became Fort Detrick, which was located there at Frederick. So I went up there, and I think I was flown. In fact, I don't recall how I got there, but anyhow, I arrived, and my last transportation before arriving at the camp was by taxi, and the taxi driver clued me into what was going on at the camp.
I thought this kind of thing was
Seemed to
top
know
secret.
quite well what was happening at the camp, and also you could see that there were some, I don't know, I guess I had flown up there from the airport to the camp. We rode by some fields which were actually part of the camp, and we could see that work was being done on plants, and some of the plants looked mighty sick. In other words, they were being killed by some means that was being apparently developed at the camp, and the taxi driver assured me that yes, there were various sorts of biological experiments going on there at the camp. Well, I figured, okay, this sounds pretty interesting. So arriving at the camp, I think I was not assigned immediately to an area, but within a few days I was assigned to a section which was run by a civilian. There were quite a few civilians who were working at the camp in various positions, usually administrative. And I was assigned to one run by a civilian named Dale Jenkins, and he informed me that this was a group devoted to rearing different kinds of arthropods, insects and their relatives, and we were instructed to try to develop mass rearing. Is it going?
Yes, you were saying that.
So yeah, Dale Jenkins informed me that that the group I had been assigned to would be involved with mass rearing, developing procedures for mass rearing of different kinds of arthropods, that is, several kinds of insects and other arthropods. And so I got to know some of the other people involved. One of them was rearing fleas. One of them was rearing ticks. And the particular group that I was assigned to was rearing mosquitoes. Now, ultimately, the idea was to develop anti-personnel weapons using these arthropods. That is, we would infect them with an appropriate disease,
such as,
and drop a container of massive numbers of these creatures back of enemy lines, and the creatures were then to spread a disease that they were carrying.
And the purpose of this was?
That was the theory.
The purpose was to wipe out the enemy soldiers by getting them sick?
Was it?
The purpose was to wipe out the enemy soldiers by getting them sick?
Yeah, exactly.
And what kind of diseases did you fiddle with?
We didn't get that far. We were primarily developing mass rearing procedures. And first we started with two kinds of mosquitoes. The very well-known Aedes aegypti, which is a very good carrier, a very good vector of yellow fever, and can can carry several other kinds of encephalitis, diseases that hit mostly the brain.
Excellent. Those are my favorite.
Yeah, right. And we also, well, Aedes aegypti is primarily a tropical mosquito, although it does occur in various parts of the United States. At least it can get established temporarily in various parts of the United States, and it does occur regularly in the far south part of the country. But in order to cover other bases, we were also rearing a tree hole mosquito that occurs farther north, and at that time went by the name Aedes triceriatus. So this thing lives in tree hole. The larvae live in tree holes ordinarily, and the adults come out and bite creatures, and they are also pretty good carriers of a number of kinds of diseases. Again, usually encephalitises that hit the brain.
Can you give me some other of those diseases? What were some diseases that most people would know that would be in this category?
Nowadays this horrible West Nile virus, but there are a number of kinds of encephalitises. St. Louis, equine, which is primarily a disease of horses, but it will get into people. There's a whole set of them, not too well known, but now and then there'll be an outbreak of one or another of these here in the U.S. So that's what we were up to. It happens that Aedes is a fairly Aedes in general is a fairly easy mosquito to rear, because they lay their eggs on whatever surface they can find right above water. So if you're rearing them you have a bunch of adults in a cage, you put a container of water and some wet paper toweling in, and they'll lay eggs on the paper toweling, and then you can let them dry, and you can hold those eggs for up to several months. They'll stay alive, dry up to several months, and then when you want to start a batch of youngsters, of larvae, you simply submerge this piece of paper with thousands of eggs on it in the water, and within a day or so you'll probably get a nice hatch of larvae.
That's amazing.
And and so then you can start rearing them, give them a little yeast, that sort of thing, and they'll get going pretty well in the water. And if you want to raise large numbers, you use a large tank and get the things going. And that's what we were doing. We were trying to work out all the kinks involved. Now and then, I don't really know what would go wrong, but sometimes a batch of eggs wouldn't hatch. Well, they'd probably been held too long or something of the sort. Now and then larvae would sort of hold in place for a few weeks without continuing to grow, and we were trying to work out problems like that. Also, somebody else at some other lab, I don't know where, was working out procedures for developing a bomb casing for these creatures. Well, when we finally got pretty well stabilized on rearing technique with our mosquitoes, I didn't follow too closely how the guys working on the fleas. Incidentally, those were rat fleas that will carry plague.
Nice.
And the people working on the ticks. I mean, I knew these guys very well, and they were, of course, my close associates in the barracks. But we were completely involved with our own project, the mosquitoes. Incidentally, mosquitoes are difficult to keep in a cage. They'll ride you out. They'll get out if you put your arm in the cage to manipulate their food supply or their water supply or something, or take eggs out. One or two will ride you out, and we rigged up a baffle in the room where we had the mosquitoes, so that you had to pass through this sort of lock, which hopefully would catch all of the mosquitoes that had ridden out on you, and so not allow them to get out into the rest of the building. But still, some would escape, and people down the hall would complain because there are mosquitoes out, and look here, we're dealing with various sorts of bacteria ourselves, and who knows what they might pick up. And this was to them a serious problem. I don't think there actually was any chance of our mosquitoes picking up anything in the building, but other people weren't so convinced, and in fact they got so annoyed with our mosquitoes that eventually they put us off in a Quonset hut by ourselves and let our mosquitoes go as they liked. Nobody else would be bothered by them. Now, this tree-hole mosquito that we were trying to rear was giving a problem in that they wouldn't mate in the cages that we had. The cages were about 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet, and or a little bit larger than that, and these mosquitoes just wouldn't mate in there, whereas the Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito, mated in there just fine. So something was wrong, and my suggestion was maybe they are a crepuscular mater. That is, they will only mate at certain light intensities. And so we tried something. We tried actually turning off the light in the rearing room, and then setting up a small desk lamp and turning it away from the culture cages, and observing what happened. Fact is that they started mating immediately. We just got them tumbling over each other, mating in numbers. And so our suggestion was that they put in a light dimmer that would bring on the light gradually in the morning and dim the light gradually in the evening, and that worked just fine. We had effect, solved the problem of rearing that one. But we never got it. Well, actually, the military guys decided right after that, well, let's not fool around with that one anymore.
With that mosquito.
And, and in fact, what they wanted us to do next was try to work out a rearing procedure for the common kind of household mosquito, Culex pipiens, which, well, probably nobody has recognized as such, but it's a little brown, ordinary-sized brown mosquito, which is very common. But the problem with Culex, with any kind of Culex, is that there is no stage that you can put aside. Here, Aedes, we had these nice handy eggs on pieces of paper, and you can keep them in a file. Yes. Whereas Culex lays its eggs on the surface of water, and they have to be in contact with the water. They make these little rafts, you've probably seen them, on the surface of water. And they hatch right into the water, and the larvae and pupae grow up in the water, and the adults then emerge out of the water. Well, this meant constantly rearing the things with no possibility of holding on to any particular stage. Another problem with them, the blood meal. Mosquitoes, in order to, well, most mosquitoes, not all, but most mosquitoes, in order to produce eggs, the females have to have a blood meal. Only female mosquitoes take blood. And this meant providing some means of giving a blood meal. With the Aedes, we used guinea pigs, and we would anesthetize the guinea pig and put it in a wire little cylinder and put it in with the mosquitoes, and of course they would bite the creature by the hundreds, and pull it out, revive it, or put it in its cage, and it would revive, scratch for a while, and it would be okay. But we were using Nembutol to anesthetize them, and a regular dosage of Nembutol on a little animal like that is a bit too much, and they would simply die after about a couple of months of treatment like that. So we had to have new guinea pigs from time to time on that account. Well, Culex was another matter, because Culex prefers birds rather than mammals for its blood meal. And so we kept young chickens, kept a few young chickens around there in the lab, and would nembutolize one of those and put it in the Culex cage, and they would feed on that. I thought it was just ridiculous trying to work with Culex because of the many problems with it, and fortunately we didn't have to do, well, I didn't have to do that very long, because I got out of the Army before that went very far. One aspect that was pretty interesting was the container that had been developed for use as a bomb. It was rigged up with a CO2 trap. The problem is if you put a bunch of living small animals of any sort, including small insects, into an enclosed container, a relatively small enclosed container, they're going to be producing CO2, and they will gradually succumb from it. CO2 is an anesthetic at strong concentrations. And so you have to have some means of entrapping the CO2. What you do is put in a little container of sodium hydroxide or potassium hydroxide in solution. I think that's what we did, and this will take in the CO2 and change the salt in solution to a carbonate. The sodium associates with chloride to simply become sodium chloride, the ordinary table salt, and the carbon becomes a carbonate, and so it's taken out of circulation, out of the air, and so the creatures are not going to asphyxiate themselves by CO2 accumulation. Also, if you put a large number of small insects in a container, they'll tend to clump up. And to avoid that, there were various baffles put inside the container. Well, we actually got around to one drop. Of course, the mosquitoes were clean. We never did, while I was in, we never did try to infect them. We took a large number of mosquitoes down to Avon Park in Florida. There was an Air Force base there at the time. I don't know if it's still there or not. And we did the drop there. The drop was done on a target about 20 feet in diameter, I suppose, and we set out guinea pigs in their containers in concentric circles around the drop point. Incidentally, the bomb container was rigged so that it would come open before impacting. That is, when it somehow detected that it was close to the ground, it simply fell apart, and the baffles containing the mosquitoes drifted down, and then the mosquitoes theoretically would fly up. They hadn't been fed recently, so they were expected, or many of them were expected, to fly out to the handy guinea pigs out there in concentric circles, and then we were to pick them up with aspirators, and so get an idea of the number that actually made it through, and were in flying condition. What actually happened was that most of the mosquitoes, the great majority, simply sat on the baffling as though they had been stunned somehow or other. And we didn't solve that problem. To this day, I can't imagine really what happened, except that they kind of get cowed, as it were, when placed in a container and held there for a while. Also, I still wonder if maybe the CO2 trap didn't work very well, and they might have gotten a bit too much CO2.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was pretty much the whole business. It was interesting sometimes to watch what was going on in my neighbor's projects. The fellow working on fleas had to keep rats for them to feed on, and the fellow working on the ticks had to feed them on a dog, and eventually the dog would sort of give out, which was unfortunate because since we were working in secret, we had to sort of dispose of the dog as best we could, when it gave out. This was rather unfortunate. Oh, when it came time for me to leave the Army, because I was only in on a 2-year stint, of course, and only about 19 months of it were to be there at Fort Detrick. My civilian boss was very, very anxious for me to stay on. I told him not a chance. Oh, he said, but I'll get you a sergeant's rating. You'll just have a great time. Well, I didn't enjoy it all that much. And I told him, look here, I have applied to graduate school at 2 Midwestern universities for doctoral work. I'm determined to get on with it as quickly as possible, and I'm not going to stay an extra day in the military, and that's all there was to that. The barracks life there, although barracks life was never very pleasant, was, I would say, extremely interesting in that almost all of the troops had advanced degrees. Some of them, especially the engineers, had only bachelor's degrees. They thought they were big stuff. But most of us had master's degrees, and there were 1 or 2 PhDs among the draftees.
Amazing.
Yeah, one of my good friends there, Dr. Mitchell Bird, had his doctorate before he was drafted, and I gather there were 1 or 2 others who also had doctorates, and then many of us were planning to get back into university and do doctorates. And one of my very good friends who was working on the tick project.
How many of these insect projects were there? You
There
mentioned
were
ticks, fleas,
there
mosquitoes.
were just ticks, fleas, and mosquitoes.
And that was all done at Fort Detrick, or Camp Detrick?
Yeah, right. There were all sorts of other projects that went on there, on various sorts of bacteria and all sorts of horrible creatures. I didn't know much about those, so but I would hear about them now and then.
What do you mean by horrible creatures? Other viruses and...
Yeah. What was it? Brucellosis was being...
What is brucellosis?
It used to be before the dairy products were always pasteurized. This disease would be carried in milk, and it results in a disease called undulant fever, which is pretty bad. It just debilitates a person. And then they were working on anthrax also.
Nice.
Oh, one aspect of life at Fort Detrick, Camp Detrick, was all the troops had to get shots for all sorts of diseases.
Extras, huh?
Yeah.
I bet.
And so I got shots for plague and all sorts of things that
normally
you just wouldn't think of.
I think I'm going to get my.
I'm
going to go down to Walgreens and get my plague shot.
Yeah.
I'll be back.
And my companion on the Mosquitoes, a fellow named David North, who had a master's degree from Penn State, I guess it was needle shy, and he would pass out whenever they took him for the set of vaccinations. Fortunately, I wasn't. I didn't care. Pumped me full of the stuff. Fine. But that was life at Fort Detrick. By the way, we still, in the Army in those days, the troops still did KP. So now and then I would get pulled off of the lab and help clean up the kitchen, which was kind of interesting. But another aspect of it was kind of nice. We were only about 35 miles from Washington, D.C., north of Washington, D.C., and if your work was pretty much caught up and you had nothing else to do, you could sign out, go down there to the U.S. Department of Agriculture library and do library work on your project, which was rather nice. I got to know the mosquito literature at the time quite well by that means. Also, of course, being close to Washington, we could get leave on weekends to go down there, and so I got to work on my own creatures at the U.S. National Museum. I got a pass to go in there on weekends and work in the research area on my own bugs. So that was rather nice. So that was life at Camp Detrick.
while working on a biological weapon.
Yeah, right. It was great fun.
All right. And so the project, you never had a name for it other than you called it what was it?
Yeah, just arthropods, I guess they
That's
called
it.
it.
Oh, interesting. All right. Well, that's always been a big conspiracy theory. There's a lot of people who have said that a lot of weird stuff has gone on at Fort Detrick. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I'm sure there'll be many people who will be interested in hearing that.
Yeah, it was
Thank you,
an
Doctor.
interesting 19 months of my life.
Recaptured here on digital camera. Thank you, Doctor.
You bet.